These are notes number 13, your second set of notes for this week. Today you will be solving quadratics using square roots. It's 12-4 in your book, continued, because the first part was graphing, which we did on the other day we had this week on the other notes, notes 12. So the essential question is, how do I solve quadratics by taking the square root? So your warm-up should be done by now. If you need to copy this down because you missed it, pause the video, copy it down, and factor. Otherwise, let's get going with today's notes. Go ahead and copy this real quick. Pause if you need to if I move too quick. What it says is you can solve equations of the form x squared equals k by finding the square root of each side. And this is really important, this next part. You cannot get real number solutions if k is negative. So if k is negative, you say no solution. So if k is negative, it's no solution. You can always check and see what that means by graphing it. You can just graph on Desmos real quick, and you'll see that if the k value is negative, like if it's x squared equals something negative, the parabola never crosses the x-axis. That's what a no solution means. So you cannot get real number solutions if k is negative. You cannot square root a negative number. Like if I try to do the square root of negative 16, it's not 4 and it's not negative 4. You just cannot do it. If you try it in a calculator, it'll tell you error or no solution or something like that. All right, here is a quick example. Okay, go ahead and copy that. If you have this as your equation, x squared minus 81 equals 0, you solve it by isolating the x squared. You want to get x squared alone. So you would add 81 to both sides. It cancels on the left, and then 0 plus 81 is 81. So then we get this. And then what we do is we square root both sides. When you square root a number, you have two possible solutions, a positive and a negative of the square root. The square root of 81 is 9, so the answers are positive and negative 9. This means x-intercepts are at 9, 0 and at negative 9, 0. I want you to try this on Desmos.com. Graph this on Desmos.com. Remember that when you graph it, you have to have it set equal to 0, and then you would put y instead of the 0. Y equals x squared minus 81. That's how you'll know what the graph looks like. So graph this on Desmos. Desmos.com. Okay. Graph y equals x squared minus 81 and see what it looks like. You should see that the parabola you might have to zoom out a little bit, but the two intercepts are at positive and negative 9 on the x-axis. That's what the solutions are. That's what it means. They're the x-intercepts. Okay, so anyways, let's pause real quick and do that, and then come back. And here are the steps. Ooh. Here are the steps. It's always good to see the steps written out. That way you have something to follow. There. Okay, that looks pretty good. So here are the steps for solving when all that you're doing is square rooting both sides. The really important thing is to isolate the x squared. So add or subtract or divide or multiply by everything to just have it be x squared equals k. That's what you have to make it look like. And then you can square root both sides. The first step, isolate x squared. The second step, square root both sides. So once you get x squared equals k, you square root both sides. Don't forget your positive and negative, plus or minus. And then you have to actually write it x equals, don't keep it the square root of x squared. By the way, in case if you didn't know, when you square root x squared, they're inverse operations. X squared means you do the number times itself. When you square root it, you are basically undoing that. So you can cancel them out. So I cancel them out and then I get x. Use like the square root button in a calculator, or some of them are easy, you'll know it. Square root k. And there is no solution if k is negative. So if that value, when you do x squared equals k, like if it's 25, you're fine. If it's negative 25, you have to write no solution. So the k can't be negative. If it is negative, you write no solution. No solution if k is negative. Make sure you do simplify. If you can square root this k value, you want to square root it, and then you write plus or minus the square root of k. All right, so finish writing that down. Pause if you need to. I'm going to move on to some examples and show you the steps of how to solve. Make it a better color. Maybe pencil. I don't know. All right, so find the solutions of each equation. So this first one, m squared minus 36 equals 0. Notice that all of these examples, they don't have a term where you have just a m or just a x. You only have the squared term and then integer or a like just a number. There is no m or just x or just d. Those kind of ones you could graph, or we'll learn a new way to do that on our next day of notes. So anyways, let's follow the steps. Isolate the x squared. So I have to, well, it's not an x in this case, it's an m, but I would add 36 to both sides. You can do this mentally, but for this example, I'll show the work. I end up getting, I'll write it over here, m squared equals 36. So the 36 and negative 36 cancel. 0 plus 36 is 36. So now I made it look like this. Now I square root both sides. So I'm going to go ahead and show that. Square root the m squared. Square root the 36. Don't forget plus or minus. I always write it like at that step to try to remind myself. The squared cancels with the square root, so I am just left with m equals plus or minus the square root of 36. If you can simplify the square root of 36, do it. I know what that is, but if you ever need to use a calculator, you can on your Chromebook or on a phone. I can't find my calculator. Oh, here it is. So just to remind you, the way you do that is, depending on your calculator, you do it differently. On this one, I think I do 36 first, and then I press the square root button, and it's 6. So just make sure you know how to use whatever calculator you're using. And so my final answer is m equals positive and negative 6, or you could also write it m equals 6 comma negative 6. There's a lot of different ways you could write it. You could write it as the intercepts like that, but when it says the solutions, this is the easiest way to just write your answer. All right, so let's go ahead and follow those steps for another problem. First, isolate the x squared. So I have to get this alone. So my first step I'm going to do mentally. I'm going to do add 15 to both sides. If I add 15, and you could write it down, and 0 plus 15, I get 3x squared equals 15. I can't leave the 3 times x squared. I have to get rid of the 3. So since that's multiplication, I have to divide both sides by 3. That cancels. 15 divided by 3 is 5. So now I've got x squared equals 5. All right, so I did step 1. Isolate the x squared equals 5. 5 isn't a perfect square, but that's okay. Now I square root both sides. So step 2, square root both sides. Don't forget to put your plus and minus signs. And then what I get is, I don't have that much room, so it's kind of squished. X equals positive and negative square root of 5. It's okay to leave your answer like that. Or if you want to get your answer as a decimal, you can do 5 and then the square root, and then round it maybe to the hundredths place, 2.23, but the 6 rounds it up to a 4, so 2.24. So I can also write x is approximately equal to positive and negative 2.24. But you can leave it as just the square root of 5. Okay? All right, next one. Let me use blue to circle that. All right. Number 3, 4d squared plus 16 equals 0. So I'm going to isolate the x squared, get x squared alone. First, I would subtract 16 to both sides. I'm going to do that mentally and rewrite it. So I have 4d squared equals negative 16. Divide by the 4. So it's just like normal solving an equation. And I have to divide that. So I would then get d squared equals negative 16 divided by 4 is negative 4. Okay, so this is where I would be like, oh, I have a negative. If I square root both sides, k is going to be negative. It's going to be no solution. So I know right now it's no solution, but I'm going to just show you what would happen if you didn't realize it and you tried to just keep working it out. I would square root both sides. D equals plus or minus square root of negative 4. Let me show you what happens if you try that in your calculator. So I would do 4, and I have to make it negative. Make sure you guys are using the negative sign and not a minus sign. When we write it out by hand, it's kind of the same thing, but the calculator knows negatives are different than minuses. Anyway, so I've got negative 4, I square root it, and it says error. That's why. It's because there's no solution. This parabola, if you were to graph it in Desmos, you would make it y equals 4d squared plus 16. It never crosses the x-axis. So try that in Desmos and see what that looks like. So my answer is actually, it might say no real number solutions on Math Excel. I'm okay if all you write is just no solution. The technical answer is no real number solutions, but no solution. All right, so that's how you do this. Isolate the x squared, square root both sides. Remember, there's a positive and a negative answer. If you graph them, you'll see why. It's because the graph crosses at positive 6 and negative 6, or this one, positive 2.24 and negative 2.24. This one does not cross the x-axis. So remember, x-intercepts are the solutions. There could be one x-intercept or two, because these are positive and negative, those are two, or there could be no solution. So now you try. Go ahead and copy down 4, 5, and 6. Try it, and hopefully there'll be time we can go over them in class. So number 4 is 4g squared equals 25. Isolate the g squared and square root both sides. 2r squared minus 32 equals 0. Isolate the r squared, get it alone, and then square root both sides. And then y squared minus 225 equals 0. Get the y squared alone, and square root both sides. All right, good luck. Make sure you guys finish up these notes with 3 questions on the left and a summary. The summary can be on another page or on a sticky note if you run out of space like I did.